Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian with the Ramsey County Libraries, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Ulysses S. Grant, taught by J.B. Peterson. And today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota and the suburban Ramsey County Libraries. We are deeply grateful to both of these organizations for making this Zoom webinar possible. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to JB. Hi, JB. I'll stay on here until you get to your shared screen up.
Last week, we discussed the Mexican-American War, at least opening comments about it. And there was a battle here in southern Texas on the Mexican border, and another battle just inside of Mexico. The third battle that we were going to talk about is where we will begin today, and that's the Battle of Monterrey. And you can see there's been a further move here inside of Mexico. And this Battle of Monterrey was 3 days in length, 21st to the 24th of September in 1846. Grant's finally given a horse. I mean, the guy was a master horse keeper and then got assigned to be doing supplies. But at any rate, he's now given a horse and he's assigned to deliver messages between different commanders on the battlefield. So he's not using the horse as a battle item and as he had hoped for. However, riding back and forth between commanders was a pretty dangerous assignment because all along the roadways that you could use, there were lots of snipers. Grant managed to survive all of this, getting messages from one uh, commander to another commander. I have my wife's sister was married to a World War II veteran who did this very kind of work, delivering messages between commanders. He once told me he always hated to have to deliver a message to General George Patton because Patton was always right up on the fighting lines. During the battle, the weather was quite severe in Mexico, so that complicates fighting quite a bit. And it was done in a city also, which is pretty severe, pretty dangerous kind of territory to be fighting on, because you got tons of houses and lots of people who are held up in the houses who have guns, rifles, other items, and it's uh, just very dangerous no matter where you're moving about. House to house fighting. Well, the United States wins the battle after 3 days here. Fighting, as I've stated, was pretty violent in the city. Consequently, this Battle of Monterey had a tremendous amount of casualties. Casualties means people who are killed, people who are wounded, and oftentimes it includes missing people or people you know to be captured. So this was a high casualty war. Now we're going to talk about the Mexican-American War and the movement into Mexico. Grant is transferred. He's now serving under General Winfield Scott, who's pictured here on the upper right. And he's transferred to a different place from Texas. He sails south along the coast of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, down to the Mexican city of Veracruz. And here you can see this is where the battles he was involved with were being fought. Now he's moved many miles south to Veracruz, but look how it's on the same latitude as Mexico City. So this makes it much easier. If you're going to attack Mexico City from up here, it's like 4 times as far as if you can be in Veracruz, get all your supplies and military personnel there, and move a much closer distance to get to Mexico City. Here's a map. I remember at West Point, Grant's favorite class was the art class. That's where you learn to draw maps. But he drew horses and other people and so on also. But here is the Veracruz starting point on the march to Mexico City. And this is a roadway that was followed, and there's famous battles, Cerro Gordo battle here. I was born in Mason City, Iowa. It's in northern Iowa. It's just south of the Twin Cities, about 120 miles, located in the county of Cerro Gordo, because Iowa became a state, uh, uh, soon after this war, and Cerro Gordo was a famous battle. So the counties, when they got named, people in that area named their county Cerro Gordo, where I was born. And you continue here are major cities. The road turns southward, and then it is followed up toward Mexico City. The next battle we're going to talk about is Molino del Rey. We're getting close to attacking Mexico City. It's located here below a couple of lakes, and they're ready to move northward into Mexico City. So the advance to Mexico City, the Battle of Molino del Rey. Grant has tremendous accomplishments at this battle and is recognized by being advanced to first lieutenant. He'd been a second lieutenant. That's the lowest ranking officer. That's where you start if you have a college degree or a West Point degree. But now his shoulder straps change to those pictured here, and he's now a first lieutenant. He advanced north into Mexico City. He restored a very necessary weapon along the way, got it fixed. People above him were impressed, and he's advanced to captain. And here are the captain shoulder pads. The Battle of Mexico City is third on this list. It occurred on the 14th of September, 1847. Grant is with the forces here in Mexico City, so he's involved, excuse me, in the Battle of Mexico City and the winning of it. And here, excuse me, here you can see U.S. troops entering Mexico City. The war is won. The Battle of Mexico City is won. And next step is a treaty. And here the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the name of the treaty that ends the Mexican-American War. And it's a treaty between the United States and Mexico. Now, it was signed on 2 February of 1848, has 4 major terms that we're going to talk about. First, Mexico ceded 525,000 square miles, a gigantic area in miles, is ceded to the United States. It's 336 million acres. Here's a close-up of the map. You can see the area that Mexico ceded to the United States by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. includes all of the present-day state of California, all of Nevada, all of Utah, and then all of what was then Arizona. Then you can see here this south west corner of Wyoming was ceded. The western fourth or so of Colorado, and the western third or so of New Mexico. Gigantic area that the United States wins as a result of this war. Second, the treaty requires Mexico to pay $15 million to the United States in compensation for items lost, cost of the war, etc. $15 million in 1848 is $620.5 million in 2026 when measured by inflation. So $620 million. Now, there's also the third item involves a payment, and this involves debts to U.S. citizens. And Mexico agrees to pay $3.25 million to U.S. citizens. That's $134.4 million in 2026, again by inflation. These two totals, compensation for the war to the United States and payment of debts owed in Mexico by U.S. citizens, $3.25 million. This is a total of $735 million in 2026. That's almost three-quarters of $1 billion. Total Mexican payments to the U.S. or to U.S. citizens. Item number 4, our final item here, is Mexico, as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, agree to recognize United States claim to Texas. Oops, there we go. Now, here, Texas was pretty much controlled here by Texans, set up a separate government. These were U.S. citizens that had moved into Spanish territory and they took over this area. Now here, this light gray area is Texas was claiming this as all of its territory. And Mexico recognizes that all this territory in light gray that that Texas claims as a part of Texas, that ends up becoming a part of the United States as the fourth element of the treaty. Let's take a look at Grant gains first during this war. First, what sorts of gains concerning warfare itself? Well, he learned a great deal about how to fight a war, how to wage a war. This was the first time he was involved in a war effort, so lessons are learned. Second of 4 items, he saw different techniques used by various commanders. You would have people who would line their forces up and then do most of their fighting on the right wing, the left wing, or the center wing, or whatever looked like a good choice to them. This was one of the things that Grant learned here. Also, how to fight, what sorts of weapons you bring in first, and what kind of an attack you're going to make, spontaneous, direct, or you kind of sit it out and wait for the enemy to move toward you. So he's learning all sorts of things by observing actual warfare. Item 3, he saw the war against Mexico as highly immoral, and he wrote about this. And the reason he thought it was incredibly immoral is because U.S. citizens who wanted heavy involvement in this war wanted new territory for the United States and they wanted that territory to then be turned to slave territory. So it was highly immoral because it was being fought to gain more territory where slavery could be legalized. Item 4 of 4. 12 years later, Civil War was punishment for U.S. aggression against Mexico. So lots of people see this as kind of a continuation of the Mexican-American War. Slavery was still a major issue. U.S. citizens wanted more territory after the Mexican War for slavery. They still want to maintain slavery when we get to 1861 and the beginning of the United States Civil War. Grant gains, quartermaster duties. Interesting thing about that connection between the U.S. Civil War and the Mexican-American War is basically World War I and World War II were the same thing. Tremendous destruction during World War I. We had a lot of young men killed. We had to wait for a group of 18 to 25-year-olds to get to that age again. We had to wait for countries to build up their military again, build up enough funds, and then World War II starts. So anyway, Grant gains quartermaster duties. Now he'd been assigned to be a quartermaster. That was a person in supply or in charge of supplies. So Grant saw these quartermaster duties, which he was very disappointed that he'd been assigned to. He now sees them as extremely helpful in warfare. Supply routes are established. You just have to set those routes up. Let's take a closer look at this map. Here are supply routes during the attack from Veracruz to Mexico City. And you can see there's roadways here. Some run north, some run south. It's good to have several of them because if this is being heavily fought down here, you can get supplies in on these two more northern territories. But you don't want to be dependent on a single route for your supplies to get to your troops, or even for your troops to get to where the battle is going to occur. So you can see here, multiple supply routes. Item 2 of 3 concerning quartermaster duties is transportation of goods was vital. Grant saw this during this war. He went, boy, this really is an important thing, being a quartermaster, because you got to get these goods to the fighting men, to aiding the troops. Militarily, transportation of goods is called logistics. So you ever hear that word logistics? They're talking about how you get things moved to where they need to be. Item 3 of 3. Wars can be won or lost in places other than battlefields. Grant realizes this. A war can be won or lost based on supplies getting to where they're needed or not being sent to the wrong place. The graphic here is the Resaca de la Palma battlefield. Mexican-American War. We're going to take a look at a word origin here. United States soldiers got very enthralled with Mexican women, and they serenaded them during the war. This was generally done alone, not in a group of four, such as we see in the picture here. And you'd be standing on the ground, and above you on the second floor on a balcony was standing some very nice looking Mexican women, and you'd serenade them with a string instrument. Look here, there's a cello. Hey, John, that's one of my pals in this class. They had cellos back then. Popular song of the day was sung to these Mexican women. Green grow the lilacs all sparkling with dew. I'm lonely, my darling, since parting with you. But by our next meeting, I'll hope to prove true and change the green lilacs to red, white, and blue. The Mexicans heard a great deal of this song. They ended up calling the U.S. soldiers by the first two words of the song, green grows. That's the origin of the term gringos, is how the Mexicans would pronounce it. Some sources say the song didn't exist till 1931 when it was a massive hit as part of the music of a Broadway musical. But there are references to this song in newspapers and people's diaries from the 1840s, so it did exist at this time. Green Grow the Lilacs. After the Mexican-American War, what's happening with uh, Ulysses Grant? He's assigned to Detroit, Michigan. So he has to go all the way from, deep into Mexico. He travels up to Detroit, Michigan. And then from Detroit, Michigan, he's sent to a couple of different places in the state of New York. The first one is at a barracks where lots of repairs are needed to these older housing units for soldiers. Gets that taken care of, and then all the way to New York, and then all the way back to Detroit again. And he still is a quartermaster in the United States Army. Here's Detroit, Michigan. You can see it's on the southeast corner of Michigan. It's on bodies of water there, Great Lakes, and famous mostly a few decades ago because of automobile manufacturing that took place there. Sackett's Harbor in New York is where Grant was sent and where he repaired barracks. It was up on Lake Ontario. I have a bigger map for you here in a minute. And then he also went to Mount McGregor, which was located in the city of Wilton, New York. It's near Saratoga Springs. So here is Sackett's Harbor, where he kind of rebuilt a fort area, the barracks in particular. And then you can see many miles away here, Saratoga County. Here sits the town of Saratoga Springs. He's actually in Mount McGregor, a town that's in that county and very close to Saratoga Springs. So he travels between these two and then back to Detroit, Michigan. California gold rush becomes a major item in U.S. history. Grant is sitting in Detroit, Michigan. Lots of people are heading to Northern California. They're looking for gold. They've heard about this gold out there. They see an opportunity to make a lot of money. California has very few military stationed in it. U.S. government becomes concerned about this. Grant, with a group of troops, is transferred to California. Here, let's take a look at the 8 major places where there are gold dig sites. Most famous is Sutter's Mill, where the gold was first discovered. Also very famous is the 8th site, which is known as the Comstock Lode. And then you can see here, there were a lot of Mormons in this area living in this spot, and there was gold at what was called Mormon Island Here's Bidwell's Bar, Rich Bar. Here's Mariposa, Murphy's, Weber's Creek. These were all places of significance for the finding of gold. Again, first here at Sutter's Mill and a very large chunk at Comstock Lode in Nevada, south of Reno. So, how does he get out there to California? Interesting route. There's no roads that run east to west all the way, anyhow. So they take water routes, and here they are. Going around South America took very long. It took way too long. Here's New York City. Look at this. You take this route around the tip of South America, long, long ways. You get down here to Cape Horn, weather is horrible in this south end of South America. Then you have to go all the way up to get to San Francisco. So, second possibility is this check this blue line here, and you take a boat to the Isthmus of Panama in Central America, which is the narrowest chunk of land in Central America. You unload all your supplies, travel them across on land to a waiting ship on the Pacific Ocean, and then you take this route up to San Francisco. But look at this thing. The distance here just from New York City to the Isthmus. By the time you draw that out, you got 5 or 6 times getting back around to that spot again of this single distance up here. So it's quite a different pathway and quite more lengthy. How more lengthy? Around the tip of South America takes 180 days. That's 6 months on board a ship, about 25 weeks. If you take the route to the Isthmus of Panama, cross on land, get back on another boat and up to San Francisco, takes 34 days. That's about 5 weeks. Only 20% of the time that it takes to get all the way around South America. Here's a close-up of this area where you cross the isthmus. New York City, you go around to the south of Florida, around the east of Cuba, down to the isthmus. You get on another boat and you take that route up to San Francisco, and takes you 20% of the time. So crossing the isthmus by train, how about that? Takes 4 hours, but there weren't very many trains available. This is 1849. I mean, we aren't enriched with trains yet. So most people would have to cross there with their goods, and most military operations same with troops and goods by horse or cart, and that took 4 days as compared to 4 hours if you were lucky enough to board a train. When Grant was crossing the isthmus on his way to the gold rush in California, there was a gigantic epidemic of cholera raging among people crossing the isthmus there and residents that had lived there. Many of his troops got sick, many of them died, so it was a killer. It killed lots of people. Lots of people were sick for an extended period, couldn't move, had to stay in bed. Symptoms include diarrhea, and it's an infection that is caused by the bacteria that's shown on the back images here, known as the Vibrio cholerae. So don't get near that crud. There were cemeteries on the isthmus as a result of the great number of deaths from cholera and the huge amount of people that were crossing there to dig for gold or to go and protect the area if they were military in nature. Here is one of those burial spots. Grant set up two hospitals to aid people. One was on land, and one was on a ship that was stationed about a mile offshore. So, huge act of necessity and kindness by Grant setting up these two hospital areas that were very sorely needed at the Isthmus of Panama there. Grant served as a nurse in the hospital, got lots of positive comments in people's diaries and newspapers, so on, about the great work that he had done as a nurse there. Oregon Territory, now that's basically where this gold rush was located. It's in present day Northern California, but that was Oregon Territory at the time. So Grant is sent just north of San Francisco when he arrives in the San Francisco area and in the gold rush area there. And he's stationed at Vancouver barracks, which are located in what today is the state of Washington. And these are the barracks there that Grant was stationed at. Two major events occur in Oregon Territory. He enters a business with a partner. They figure they can make money because there's tons of people have flooded into this area of what is today Northern California. He invests $800 with this partner. In 2026, by inflation, that is almost $34,000. And another major item in the area is Native Americans. And Grant was very concerned about their treatment, writing about how they need to be respected. They should become like white folks, get a farm, etc. But I don't like what I'm seeing about their treatment, is what Grant was saying. Native Americans, Grant concerned about their treatments. Another major a major concern here was United States treaties with Indians. I think we have something like 350 such treaties and broke every one of them. But part of the treaty was you let us occupy your land. We'll bring in goods for you, food, clothing, material, things like that, and we'll distribute those to you free of charge. And U.S. agents were then stationed in the areas where we had agreed to do this with Native Americans. However, the agents see the high quality of these goods, and why should they go to the natives? I could sell them. So they do. They sell them to white people who have moved into the area, European ancestry folks. They never get distributed to the Native Americans, and the U.S. agents make off with the money. Second item about this area is diseases were brought from Europe to Native Americans. Measles and smallpox in particular killed off millions of Native Americans. The diseases, this can be argued, but the diseases didn't exist in the Americas. In the Americas, there were venereal diseases, and uh, people visiting in the Americas, early explorers, took those venereal diseases back to Europe. Now, from Europe came measles and smallpox, which had not existed in the Americas. So these venereal diseases and then measles and smallpox, no immunity in Europe, in the Americas, and so a tremendous amount of people died. Millions of people died from these diseases. Number of natives in the United States in 1850, estimates run all the way from 20 to 100 million. Now that's just in the current United States, 50 states. Most say it was probably about 40 million people in the present day United States who were Native Americans. 40 million. Today, there are 750,000 Native Americans in the United States. This means about 2% of the amount that were in the U.S. in the 1850s. Now, this is generally referred to as a genocide. Andrew Jackson was making forced marches of Native Americans out of the eastern U.S. over into Oklahoma in particular, massive numbers dying on these forced marches of diseases, of just the difficulties of travel, the shortages of food, etc. But we're at a point today, 175 years later, where there are only 2% the number of Native Americans as there were in 1850. Where'd these Native Americans come from? Well, they migrated from Asia, Mongolia in particular. Here's Mongolia, and this is Asia. Here's Russia, and lots of walking along this pathway and then crossing here at this very narrow point here, known as the Bering Strait, into North America and eventually migrating into Central and then South America. There were no humans in the Americas before these migrations out of Asia. So they go across the Bering Strait, and they're able to cross during ice ages because ice was locked up on land. The oceans were made much less deeper by a couple hundred feet. Bering Strait is like maybe only 180 feet deep, so you could cross on land there. So migrating peoples were able to cross into the Americas out of Asia. Now, Native Americans have the same eye shape that Asians do, known as the epicanthic eye fold or the Asian eye. Also, Native Americans have the same two blood types as Asians do. So that's pretty strong proof that this is where Native Americans came from, was out of Asia. During the ice ages, this water was all locked up on land, or it might have been water at some points, and it froze so you could walk across it. Ice ages lasted from about 18,000 to 40,000 YBP. That's years before present. So 18 to 40,000 years ago, there were several of these migrations, really big one about 24,000 years ago. And then they slowly moved southward. Oh, Sarah Palin, I can see Russia from my house. These Asians all traveled across the Bering Strait into Alaska. she was from Alaska and lived on the coast. She could look across here just 10 miles as the Bering Strait and see Russia from her house. She was vice presidential candidate running with John McCain in 2008. Fort Humboldt, California. Grant's transferred to Fort Humboldt in the fall of 1853. This is a drawing of that area. There's Grant on a horse surveying troops, and you've got buildings, barracks, housing in the background. Here, notice here, a couple of Native Americans watching the situation. Quick drink. This is where the Fort Humboldt area is located. Today it is a historic site and you can visit it, but it's located in this area here. Here's the San Francisco area down here, so it's north, a good distance north of San Francisco, and that's where uh, Grant was stationed for several months. Been away from his family for many of these months. Here's a drawing. This is Grant. This is his wife. And these are the three children at the time there. Grant began to drink lots of alcohol. A lot of people say it was due to separation from his family, not realizing what he was doing, still figuring out what to do. Um, his commander spoke to him about his alcohol consumption, told him to stop drinking, please. And if you don't stop drinking, we need to have you resign. Well, Grant resigned, and that was on the 31st of July, 1854. Nothing was placed on his military record about drinking or suspicions that he was drinking or charges people were making against him. Uh, Problem, if it did indeed exist, which it probably did, probably was due to the separation from his family. Now, during the Civil War, this is 1854, Civil War 7 years off. During the Civil War, Grant has come back and is promoted to a general. But there are lots of comments by people in their diaries and in newspapers during the early 1860s about Grant's drinking. Some of those stating that he was indeed an alcoholic. Tell me what brand of whiskey Grant drinks. I'd like to send a barrel of it to my other generals. Abraham Lincoln quote. He said, I don't need to hear about these rumors or truths that are being spoken about Grant. The fact is, he fights and he wins. So, finding a new job now, we're going to go 1854. What's Grant do during this 7 year hiatus out of the military? He resigned at age 32 after graduating from West Point at age 22. So he's got 10 years now that he's been in the military, war in Mexico, stationed in Detroit and New York, and then taking troops into the California Gold Rush area. And he's made no preparation for any kind of career outside of the military, and yet he's now quit at age 32. In 7 years, he would rejoin and, of course, become the most famous general in the Civil War for the Union forces. We're going to look at 5 job situations over the next 7 year period that Grant got involved with. His father offered him a job in Galena, Illinois. His father ran a leather company there. You can see Galena is located in the very far north western area of Illinois. Uh, by the way, a phenomenal place to visit. Uh, After my wife and I were married and had uh, gotten enough work together, finished schooling, and were starting to make some money, first trip we took during the summer was down to Galena, Illinois. We were actually going to go visit her brother who lived down in this area, but we stopped in Galena because of Grant. And it's just a phenomenal place to visit. And a little bit more on that later. Anyhow, he couldn't bring his wife or children if uh, you come up here to Galena. Now, remember, Grant's father was an abolitionist. Grant's wife owned a slave. Her parents were slave owners. Uh, so Grant's father says, I don't want you bringing those slave owners up here with you. That includes your wife and children. So Grant rejected the offer. He stayed in St. Louis, where his wife and her family were living at the time. So Grant rejects the offer to go to Galena. Instead, he farms outside of St. Louis. His brother-in-law, his wife's brother, had a lot of land there out in the open territory surrounding St. Louis. Grant went in. There, it was a forested area, so he has to cut down trees, and he sells them as firewood. He goes into St. Louis, where there's no longer a forested area. He takes the wood with him, and people buy it from him. He sets up a area where he's a street merchant, and he's able to sell this lumber and make money. So he's not only farming on his brother-in-law's land, he's also clearing the land of wood and selling the wood as a street merchant. He's aided in the farming by a slave who's owned by his wife. And he finally, 1856 now, he quits the farming part and they move to her father's mansion, his father-in-law. And that's who's pictured here, Frederick Dent. Julia Dent Grant is his wife's name. Frederick Dent is Mrs. Grant's father. They move to his plantation and aid him in farming the land that he is on. He builds a house there. It was pretty run down, and it was actually a rebuild of a house. This is a picture of it, restored, and Grant and the slave repaired it, and he was able to live on this father's land. 1857, horrible economic depression in the United States. Very hard on farmers. 90-some% of all people were farmers in the 1850s in the United States. So Grant had this land that his father-in-law said, it's yours, you farm it. He rents it out, has somebody else farm it, so he gets rent money off of it. His family moves into the father-in-law's mansion. This is Frederick Dent Grant's mansion. Now, in order to save money and not have to house themselves in that house that I showed you a few slides ago that Grant repaired, he and the slave fixed it. Instead, now they get off of that land and rent it. They don't have the house to have to maintain any longer and cut wood for it, etc. And he gets 850 acres of land from his father-in-law, Frederick Dent. That's 1.3 square miles. My wife's father farmed from the 1930s to through the 1970s on 80 acres of land, 1/10 of what Grant had been given by his father-in-law. Grant freed the slave that his wife owned. Value of the slave was $1,000. That's about $42,500 in 2026. And this was the slave's house on the property there. Item 3 of 5 about jobs that Grant had during this 7 years out of the military. They moved from the father-in-law's land outside of St. Louis that was all farmland and moved into St. Louis proper itself, where Grant got a job in real estate. And Julia, his wife, had a cousin who owned this real estate company, and it was involved in bill collecting. Hey, you owe 2 months' rent. Somebody was behind in their rent, or you're behind in making payments on real estate he sold to you, and so on. Well, Grant hated this job, having to go around and talk to people who couldn't pay and trying to make them pay. So he quit doing that. He applied for a county engineering job, and he had qualifications, had a college degree from West Point, but he didn't get the job. Reason? St. Louis authorities, now Missouri's a slave state. They knew that Grant's father, living up in Illinois, was an abolitionist, and he was a Democrat. So they assumed Grant had these same sorts of ideas, that he was an abolitionist, and he had freed a slave. So all this piled up against Grant. People didn't want to hire him down in the slave state of Missouri as a result. So we're now at April 1860. It's 8 months before the first state secedes from the Union, and it's a year before the attack on Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War. Fort Sumter is out in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South Carolina. And that's when the Grants say, okay, we're moving to Galena, and he's taken his family with him. And that's where his father is at, and he's going to be allowed to work in his father's leather store. Again, great place to visit. This is Grant's home in Galena. He didn't have money to buy this at this time, but at the end of the Civil War, people in Galena said, we have built you a mansion. Come back and live here. And that's this particular house. And you can see this is a modern picture. You go to Galena, you can visit Grant's home there. That was built for him as a reward for his service in the Civil War by the citizens of Galena, where his father owned the leather shop. Here it is, Union Leathers. And today it's a museum. You can go in, look around. There's the Union Leather shop. Actually, what they made was mostly reins, horses, leather items that you would use on horses. At the top of this stairway is where Grant lived. At the bottom of this stairway was his father's leather shop. Now, this was a stairway. Of course, it wasn't concrete in those days. Concrete didn't exist in the 1850s yet, but it was a wooden stairway now made into concrete. And you can walk this uh, stairway in the same place that Grant walked it daily to go to work at his father's leather store and return to his home in the evening. And we stayed in a bed and breakfast that was up the hill there. This is on a river, the town of Galena, so it's got quite a slant to the town. And a lot of people from Chicago moved into this area back in the late 1800s. And even today, people from Chicago retire there. They had lots of money back then. They have lots of money today. Uh, Many of the houses in Galena are spectacular. So it's a place you can drive around and just look at houses too. And many of them have been made into bed and breakfasts. Family lives on the first floor. The top floor is 8 bedrooms and bathrooms and are rented out. So, April 1860, Grant's father allows him to work in the leather store. Main product, horses' harnesses. Such as you see pictured here. Grant was successful in Galena. He'd gathered a lot of debt with the jobs that he'd had during the first 6 years of being out of the military. As a result of the money he was making in Galena, he was able to pay off all 6 years of that debt that he had accumulated. Amazing side note here, Grant's father studied leathercraft under the famous abolitionist John Brown, pictured here. John Brown was from Kansas. He moved northward, took over Harper's Ferry military base. Well, hold it, you don't take over a military base. Troops are sent in, he's captured, he's tried for the crime and sentenced to hanging, and he was indeed hung. But John Brown is a very famous, probably among the most famous of the abolitionists prior to the Civil War. And Grant's father studied leathercraft under the famous John Brown. Side note, when we were in Galena, we visited a candy store, and in the back were like 4 or 5 framed items, and they were handwritten. I asked the guy, "What the heck is that?" And he said, "Oh, that's my dad's recipe for Chuckles. My dad invented Chuckles candy out of this candy store here." And and the son said, "And I run it now." So another interesting thing about Galena, you can go to the candy store and it's where the guy that invented Chuckles. I haven't seen him. I don't know. I haven't looked for him, but when I was a kid, this was a very popular candy. Civil War begins. Northern cities had meetings. How are we going to respond? States are succeeding. The Union Fort off the coast of South Carolina has been attacked by Southern forces. Now, how do we respond to that? What do we do about it? So there's lots of meetings in northern cities, including a meeting in Galena, Illinois, where Grant is now living, and Grant attends the meeting. The next day, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops. Grant volunteers. And of course, he'd been an officer. Grant's first assignments during the Civil War. There are 6 items here. First, He's asked to command an Illinois militia group. He says, no, no way. He's not going to be a part of a state militia. He wants federal attention. He went to West Point. He wants a national job. He's twice rejected for a national job. He had held the rank of captain when he quit back in 1854. So he's what's called a low-ranking officer, captain and lower. Major, colonel, and generals are considered high-ranking officers. Anyhow, he's twice rejected for a federal job. Finally, he gained support of a congressman for a federal job. Uh, and Grant really felt his West Point degree meant that he was in line for a federal job. He's assigned to the Illinois governor. Now he gets this federal job, but he's assigned to a state governor. And he's asked to create 10 militia groups for the state of Illinois as a federal officer. So here he is getting militia groups rounded up in different areas around Illinois, getting people to volunteer for them. These will become U.S. soldiers who fight in the Civil War. Grant gained the rank of colonel. Well, he's goes major, colonel. Well, he's commanding these volunteer regiments in Illinois. The regiment that he was commanding gets assigned to the state of Missouri. It never seceded from the Union, but it was a slave state. It supported the Confederacy, and there were Confederate troops there, and they were being built up. So troops from Illinois are sent into Missouri, stop it from becoming a Confederate state, stop the growth of Confederate troops there. So Missouri was part of the Western Theater. Here's Missouri, and here you can see there's an Eastern Theater, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia during the Civil War. Then there's a Western Theater, and this is where Grant fought, and it includes southern states from Kentucky to Florida, from North Carolina to Mississippi. Then the Trans-Mississippi. This is the Mississippi River flows through here. Trans-Mississippi includes Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, what would become Oklahoma, but was now Indian Territory, where Andrew Jackson had forcefully marched from Georgia to Oklahoma, large segments of native populations. And you got Louisiana here. And so you got the Trans-Mississippi, the Western Theater. This is where Grant was stationed. This Eastern Theater is most famous for its battles, especially the Battle of Gettysburg, that consequently, it's kind of strange to find out that in this kind of less fought area is where Grant is, and he was over in this area. Of course, Sherman did his march to the sea here, splitting the South in half, coming down like this and through Georgia and out here, and he split the South in half here in this Western Theater. That was a famous part of the Western Theater. But so was the Battle of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, I'm sorry. Grant advances to brigadier general now. He's gone from major to colonel to general. He plans attacks along the Mississippi River. This dark blue area is the Mississippi River. The Union forces want control of the entire Mississippi River. Control of that river would mean freer movement out of northern states up here, like Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And they could get out into the Gulf of Mexico and coming in, supplying Western troops over here, this Western theater of the Civil War. So you control the river, you got greater movement of Union troops, greater movement of Union supplies. Look here how it connects with the Ohio River. You can bring lots of supplies in to that area. When I would teach this to normal age students, they just had no idea of these battles over here along the Mississippi River. Vicksburg, Missouri, pictured here. Or Mississippi. Here's Natchez and Biloxi. Here's New Orleans, Louisiana down here. So Mississippi becomes where Grant is in charge of the very decisive battle in the Western Theater of Vicksburg. And it's really not a battle, it was a siege. Battles would last 3 days, they were over, somebody won or lost. A siege, you could surround a city for 6 weeks, starve them out, finally win. So here's Kentucky area up here. Confederates gain a lot of ground in Kentucky, and they say, okay, we're going to invade Illinois, a northern state. So Grant is told to move against this attack up here also. Grant attacks in Kentucky. Lincoln didn't like Grant's attack. He doesn't like states. Kentucky had not seceded. Lincoln wanted to maintain their neutrality, but there's Confederate troops there. They're moving into Illinois. And so Grant is angry, or Lincoln is angry with Grant for attacking these troops in Kentucky and Illinois because Lincoln wants to maintain Kentucky neutrality. Grant is then ordered by Lincoln not to attack anywhere along the Mississippi River. Don't do it again. Battle of Belmont. This was 7 November 1861. It's located in Missouri, way down in the southeastern corner. Here it is on the Mississippi River. Right there is the spot. Southern Missouri, Mississippi River. Grant had small forces, about 2,500 troops. There were more Confederate troops than the North had stated there would be. They estimated wrong. Grant took a look at what was going on. He says, there's no way we don't have enough troops. They have much stronger forces. He retreated. This battle of Belmont was lost. The Civil War. Battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Fort Henry was a one-day battle on 6 February of 1862, and a 5-day battle at Fort Donelson, 11 to 16 February of 1862, starting less than a week after the defeat of Fort Henry. Here is where Fort Henry is located, kind of a difficult map, but here's the Mississippi River over here. Fort Henry is on the Ohio River, and it is near Kentucky and Mississippi, and gain control of the Tennessee River is the objective of winning these two fort areas. Here's Fort Donelson. Now here's Fort Henry up here. Fort Donelson, not very many miles away. So gained control of the Cumberland River on Fort Donelson. Rivers were very important areas of travel, and here's the Cumberland River. So that's why we're looking at these battles, but all the time talking about rivers. There weren't a lot of roads, and you could travel faster on the rivers depending on what direction you were going. Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, both located near where this red dot is in Tennessee, right on the Kentucky border there, very close to Missouri. Plan, attack both forts and use gunboats. There's a Civil War gunboat, cannons sticking out of the side of it. So these were river battles, not land battles. And these forts were located on rivers in order to stop traffic along them or control traffic along them. Fort Henry is immediately conquered. It really wasn't built very well as a military fort, a defensive fort, or an offensive fort. Uh, it was built to fight, but more than anything, all they did was observe traffic on the river, and then they could report it to other stations along the river. Here are gunboats in this bottom. Fort Donelson had great defenses, lots of guns like this, aimed out at the river. They could take out boats. Grant had 40,000 troops. The Confederates had 17,500, not very many. Uh, by comparison, the Confederates leave uh, the fort and confront Union troops, retreat back to the fort so they could go in and out of this fort, and the Confederates eventually surrender. Wondering how we're doing with questions, and is this a time to stop or not?
We have a few questions. Maybe we'll
Okay.
get more.
Let me quit
It's
this and I'll go over the beginning of these two fort battles next week also. So good. Now let's
okay.
do uh, I
Do you
can,
have a stop sharing button? Trying to
yeah.
think.
Uh, Grayson has always done that. Ah, there we
Mhm.
go. Thanks. Got
So,
it. Good.
okay.
Thank you.
So we're going to travel back to the Mexican-American War. We have a question on how did they decide the boundaries of the Mexican secession?
Uh, well, that was part of the negotiations when the two countries would get together and say, the winner was the United States. They'd say, here's our demands. Mexico didn't have a great deal to say about it. They maybe said, hey, we really need thus and such because there's a tremendous amount of water supply for northern Mexico there, and we don't want you to hurt us that bad. And out of compassion, you might say, yeah, okay, fine, you can maintain that control of that. But basically, the victor would say, here's what we get.
Well, on the western side of Texas, isn't it the Rio Grande? So because
Yes.
of where it was before that one map, it was way over before and then it moved out to the Rio Grande.
Yeah,
So
about three-fourths of Texas was owned by Mexico. And now the United States said we want to own all of Texas. So that Rio Grande River, which actually runs north of Mexico and then south down between Mexico and Texas. So that also was part of the concession, as were parts of those states that I showed, Colorado and Wyoming and and then all of California, New Mexico, Arizona.
Right. I think you see how much rivers play such a huge part in boundaries and um, those nice, neat, straight line state divisions are not generally how
Yeah,
things are divided up. So,
maps generally are not squared off, and you can look at a map of Ramsey County. So just look it up out there, folks, if you wish, and Minnesota counties. And there are Minnesota River is a border for counties. The Mississippi River is a border for the states.
yes, where things come into issue is when the course of a river changes.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
um,
Then it gets interesting. Usually they leave the line where the river had been.
mhm. Um, how many US presidents were soldiers? We know that Eisenhower was one, but how many other US presidents do you have an idea?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I wrote an article about this and I sent it out years ago to my class mailing list for senior citizens. And about 62% of all uh, U.S. presidents have been a military officer. So we're pushing two-thirds, certainly 60%. One U.S. president was a private, never gained an officer status. That was James Buchanan, who was president right before Lincoln. And at the end of his term is where the southern states started to secede. The U.S. presidency is by and large stems out of the military, or that's certainly something to talk about. Hey, I was in the military and I served my country, and that becomes a campaign. Doesn't really become a campaign issue. It becomes a campaign delight, kind of. But yeah, there's lots of people that say we're basically a military establishment. We're the biggest military in the history of the world. You take the U.S. military today, you have to go. What are the next biggest militaries? You have to go to 2 through 11 of the next biggest militaries after the U.S. in order to gain the same spending amount as the U.S. does alone. So the next 10, the next top 10 military establishments worldwide spend only as much money as the U.S. does. And of course, now Donald Trump has called for it's a 44% rise in the military budget to $1.5 trillion is what's being requested. So,
Okay, let's see. Um, Someone says, I've read that the US later wanted more territory from Mexico, but didn't succeed in getting it. Is that true?
yes, and I don't know a great deal about that, but uh, there was demands for more territory than what we've have gotten. So,
So,
and I mean, we attempted to invade Cuba, for instance, under John F. Kennedy, and retreated from it. Uh, and the same, there have just been endless. Much of the concerns about Mexico and Central America generally is uh, sugar and fruit. And we've done a lot of little invasions and occupations in Central America to protect United Fruit Company and sugar companies and some meat companies too. Uh, but these we never permanent. I mean, it's easy to say we never permanently take them over. We don't make them part of the United States, but we got troops there,
Hmm.
and we've set up dictators in many of those countries that are cooperative with us. And money is very much controlled then about due to the products that those areas have. And it has led in Central America to two-class societies.
So, okay. Somebody's wondering about Minnesota's involvement in the Civil War. And they're saying, I understand Minnesota was a no-slave state, except for those working for staff at Fort Snelling or slaves traveling with those on vacation. Was Minnesota's interest in the Mississippi River control about military strategy support and possibly commerce supplies for Minnesota? And did Grant have any contact with Colonel Colville?
Um, we're far north
Hmm.
and away from the battles. Uh, Minnesota's most famous for battles on that eastern side. Battle of Gettysburg. A lot of people argue it was won by Minnesota. Uh, there were a huge group of Minnesota troops there, and there was a charge on the left flank of Confederate troops, and there was a general for the Union Army, and he looked over at a commander for a large group of horses and troops. He said, "Where are you from?" "Minnesota." He said, "Stop that advance." There was 1,500 Confederate soldiers coming across. Minnesota had about 250 men that charged at them, but broke up the um, group, broke up the charge. Tremendous number of casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg for the state of Minnesota. Um, but yeah, we were removed
Right.
geographically speaking.
So really the warships didn't really make it up to St. Paul
No,
per se. So I think it's always surprising to see just how many warships there were on the rivers, um,
yeah,
and how
south,
differently,
and yeah, that was in the south.
right? So, um, more questions are welcome, but let's see. Somebody's going, not a Sarah Palin fan, but she actually said that Russia was visible from Alaska from an island, which is true on a clear day. Um, Tina Fey is the one who came up with the satirical line of, I can see Russia from my house.
Yeah,
But yeah, just
yeah,
comment on that.
that's
Um,
correct.
okay, couple things housekeeping wise. Um, you wanted to share about your newsletter you had mentioned
Uh,
previously,
yeah, I have a
if
mailing.
you want to
I
do that.
have a mailing that it's got over 300 people on it who have signed up in the past for this class. And I put out a weekly mailing. When class is in session, it involves a lecture outline. Um, and frequently I'll put a little two-page article, quick read thing in. I always have, hey, we're having lunch on Monday at Great Moon Buffet. There's always that marker in there. So if anyone would like to be on that mailing list, feel free to write to me, and I assume you can put my address on that.
I'll put it in chat
Yeah,
for you. So,
it's JB1717 at Comcast.net, all small case, of course. JB1717 at Comcast.net. feel free if you're interested. I'll put you on the mailing list. You can read where lunch is. You can look over the course, the lecture outline for the next week when class is in session, or read an article, or occasionally I forget to do it. So you can go, where the heck is that mailing this week? Only happens a couple times a year. So
Okay, let me get that into chat and you can answer. Minnesota doesn't talk much about the regiment that surrendered to Bedford Forrest, who attached who attacked without about half the troops. I don't know if you want to mention anything about him.
and
Um,
I don't know a great deal about that, but yes, that's a famous thing for Minnesota. It was unattached to Grant, and that's why I hadn't mentioned it. But yeah, thanks.
so okay. Also next week I'm not going to be here. We'll have somebody else doing the moderating, taking off for my birthday. And but JB will still be here along with our tech support from Grayson. So, okay, otherwise we have no open questions. If anyone has anything they want to ask a question about, feel free to do so. Otherwise, it's a beautiful day out. I've already been outside today and the sun is shining. I recommend that everyone get a little fresh air today if they can. And otherwise, nothing wrong with closing a minute early. JB, thank you for today. Thanks everyone for your questions. I hope that everyone has a good day. We'll let you know when the first video gets up on YouTube in case you want to catch on one you might have missed. Otherwise, everyone have a good day.
Good, thank you.